You won't believe this, but the future king of Israel was once just a young boy, taking care of sheep in a field. Imagine that. How could the person who would one day lead an entire nation start off with such a simple and humble job? But that's exactly what happened with David. David was the youngest of 8 brothers and lived in the small town of Bethlehem. While his brothers were off doing more important things, David spent his days alone in the fields, watching over his father's sheep. At first glance, it might seem like a boring and lonely job, but David wasn't like other kids. He wasn't afraid of the dangers that lurked in the wilderness. In fact, he faced them head-on with courage and determination. One day, a huge lion snuck into the field, trying to grab one of the sheep. Fear might have made others run, but not David. With only a sling and his staff, he bravely fought the lion and saved the sheep. And that wasn't the only dangerous animal he faced. A bear came to attack too, but again, David stood his ground, defending his flock with everything he had. His heart was full of love for those little sheep, and he wasn't about to let anything harm them. While he was protecting the sheep, David would also spend his time playing his harp. His music was so beautiful that even the birds seemed to stop and listen. Can you picture the peaceful scene? The sunlight shining down, birds singing, and David playing his harp surrounded by his sheep. But that peaceful life wouldn't last forever. One day, something surprising and exciting happened. A man named Samuel, a prophet of God, came to David's house. Samuel had been sent by God to anoint the future king of Israel. When he saw David, he knew immediately that this was the boy God had chosen. Samuel took a horn of oil and poured it on David's head, anointing him as the future king. David, just a shepherd boy, had been chosen for something much bigger than himself. Anticipation filled the air. David's life was about to change forever. Little did anyone know, the quiet shepherd boy would grow up to become one of the greatest kings Israel had ever known. But that's a story for later. For now, David's days in the fields were a reminder that even in the most ordinary jobs, something extraordinary can happen. David's love for his sheep, his courage in the face of danger, and his beautiful music showed everyone that there was something truly special about him. He wasn't just a boy from Bethlehem. He was a boy chosen by God, destined for greatness. There was a time when an entire army was too scared to fight one giant. That's right, one giant. This giant, named Goliath, was over 9 feet tall, stronger than 10 bears combined, and he could crush anyone who dared face him. The Israelites, who were supposed to be brave and strong, were terrified of him. They couldn't stop shaking, and they didn't know what to do. They were stuck in fear. Goliath was a warrior for the Philistine army, and every day, he marched to the edge of the battlefield and called out to the Israelites. His booming voice echoed across the valley, shouting, "Send someone to fight me. If you win, we'll serve you. But if I win, you'll serve us." His words sent a wave of fear through the Israelite soldiers, and nobody dared to step forward. Even the bravest men didn't want to challenge him. Can you imagine what that felt like? The soldiers of Israel, angry and embarrassed by their fear, knew they needed a hero, but no one was brave enough to fight. The days passed, and the fear kept growing. Goliath's voice rang out every morning and evening, mocking them. He wasn't just a giant. He was a bully, taunting the Israelite army and making them feel small. It felt hopeless. But then something surprising happened. A young boy named David, the youngest of 8 brothers, came to visit the army camp. He wasn't a soldier. He was there to bring food to his brothers, who were fighting in the Israelite army. When David heard Goliath's challenge, something inside him clicked. He wasn't afraid. He was angry that this giant was insulting God's people. "Why are you letting this Philistine defy the armies of the living God?" David asked. His anger was real, and his heart was full of courage. David was no soldier, but he had faced lions and bears when he was protecting his sheep. If God had helped him defeat those dangerous animals, why wouldn't God help him now against this giant? David loved his people, and he was ready to fight for them. When King Saul heard about David's bravery, he couldn't believe it. "You're just a boy," Saul said, shaking his head. "You can't fight Goliath. He's a warrior." But David didn't back down. "I can do it," he said, "because God is with me." The king, seeing David's determination, finally agreed to let him fight. Saul even offered David his own armor, but it was way too big and heavy for the young boy. Instead, David decided to use his sling and 5 smooth stones from the river. It wasn't much, but it was all David needed. As David walked out to face Goliath, the giant laughed and sneered. He couldn't believe this tiny boy was coming to fight him. Goliath cursed David and said, "I'll crush you like a bug." But David wasn't scared. In fact, he was full of anticipation and excitement. He knew that with God's help, he would win. David took a stone from his bag, placed it in his sling, and with all his strength, he swung it toward the giant. The stone flew through the air like a bullet, and then, surprise, it hit Goliath right in the forehead. The giant's knees buckled, and he crashed to the ground with a loud thud. The entire Israelite army, which had been hiding in fear, suddenly erupted into cheers. They had won. David, the small boy, had done what no one else could do. David's victory over Goliath was more than just a battle won. It was a moment of triumph over fear and hopelessness. It showed everyone that no matter how big the challenge, you can face it with courage and faith. With God's help, anything is possible, even defeating a giant. David had proven that you don't need to be big or strong to win. You just need to have a heart full of faith, courage, and love. And just like that, David had become a hero. David, the boy who defeated the giant Goliath, had to run for his life and hide in caves for years before he became king. It's hard to imagine that a hero like him had to go through so much fear and hardship before finally wearing the crown. But that's exactly what happened. After David defeated Goliath, everyone knew who he was. The Israelites were amazed at his courage and victory, and King Saul started to see David as a great warrior. David's fame spread fast. He led the Israelite army into battle, and everywhere he went, people cheered for him. They sang songs about him. Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands. The crowd loved David, and Saul began to feel something dark growing inside him: jealousy. At first, Saul was happy with David's success. But as the songs got louder and the crowds got bigger, Saul started to feel angry and threatened. He couldn't stand the thought that people might like David more than him. In his envy, Saul became afraid that David would take his throne, and that fear turned into something much worse. Saul wanted to get rid of David. One night, while David was playing his harp to soothe Saul, something terrible happened. Saul, filled with rage, threw a spear at David, trying to kill him. Horror filled David's heart as he barely ducked out of the way. Saul's jealousy had turned into hatred. David had to escape quickly, and from that moment on, he was forced to run for his life. David had no choice but to flee, and he became a fugitive, hiding in caves and secret places. For years, David lived in fear, constantly running from Saul's soldiers. But through all of this, something amazing happened. David didn't become bitter or angry. Instead, he trusted in God. He knew that God had promised him the throne, and he believed that no matter how hard things got, God would take care of him. During this time, David gathered a group of loyal followers, men who believed in him and his cause. They were rough men, some of them outcasts, but they stuck together and supported David through the hardest of times. David's heart was filled with love and loyalty for them, just as they felt the same way toward him. One day, while David and his men were hiding in a cave, Saul came into the same cave to rest. David's men saw this as the perfect opportunity to strike. They whispered, "This is your chance. God has given Saul into your hands. Take him down and become king." But David didn't do it. Even though Saul was trying to kill him, David didn't want to harm him. Instead, he crept up quietly, cut off a piece of Saul's robe, and then waited. When Saul left the cave, David stepped out and showed him the piece of robe he had cut. He said, "I could have killed you, but I chose not to. You are still the king." Saul was surprised and moved by David's mercy. His heart softened for a moment, and he realized how close he had come to losing his life. He even admitted, "You are a better man than I. You will be king one day." But Saul's jealousy didn't fade completely. He still wanted to hunt David down. David didn't let Saul's anger destroy him. He kept trusting God and waiting for the right time. Finally, after many years of running and hiding, Saul's reign came to an end, and David became the king of Israel, just as God had promised. The people who had once cheered for David now welcomed him with open arms, and the young shepherd boy was crowned the ruler of a mighty nation. David's story shows us how love and patience can help you face even the darkest times. Despite Saul's attempts to destroy him, David's faith in God never wavered. And in the end, he became the king everyone knew he was meant to be. David, the hero who defeated Goliath and became one of Israel's greatest kings, made a huge mistake that changed everything. A mistake so big that it shook his entire kingdom. But don't worry, this story also shows how David's heart was broken and how he sought to make things right. David had everything. He was king, he had a powerful army, and the people loved him. But something happened that would change his life forever. One evening, while his soldiers were out fighting in a war, David stayed behind in the palace. From his rooftop, he saw a woman named Bathsheba. She was beautiful, and David couldn't take his eyes off her. She was bathing, and David knew it was wrong to stare, but his desire grew stronger. This moment of temptation led David down a dangerous path. David, the king who had always been known for his wisdom, let envy and lust cloud his judgment. He sent someone to ask who she was. When he found out she was married to Uriah, one of his loyal soldiers, David didn't stop. He sent for Bathsheba, and they spent the night together. Soon, Bathsheba sent word to David. She was pregnant. David was horrified. What would people think? What would happen if the truth came out? His heart was filled with fear and guilt. To cover up his sin, David thought of a plan. He called Uriah back from the battlefield, hoping he would spend time with his wife and think the child was his. But Uriah, a man of honor, refused to go home while his comrades were still in battle. David's plan failed, and he became even more desperate. In a moment of anger and disgust with himself, David made an awful decision. He told his army commander to place Uriah at the front lines of battle, where the fighting was fiercest. Uriah died in battle, and Bathsheba was left a widow. David thought the problem was solved, but this dark secret would haunt him. Then a prophet named Nathan came to David. Nathan told a story about a rich man who took a poor man's only lamb, even though the rich man had plenty of his own. David became angry when he heard the story. "That man should be punished," he shouted. But Nathan pointed at David and said, "You are the man. You took what wasn't yours, and you have sinned against God." David was shocked and ashamed. He realized the full weight of what he had done. His sin was more than just a mistake. It was a betrayal of his people and of God. In that moment, David wept and confessed his sin. "I have sinned against the Lord," he admitted. Nathan told David that, even though God had forgiven him, there would still be consequences for his actions. David's life was never the same. His family was torn apart by the consequences of his choices. His son, who was born from his sin with Bathsheba, died. And while David's kingdom remained strong, his own heart was forever marked by regret and sorrow for the hurt he caused. But David's story doesn't end in darkness. He wrote beautiful psalms, asking God for forgiveness and mercy. He knew he had sinned, but he also knew that God's love and forgiveness could heal even the deepest wounds. David's fall from grace teaches us that even the greatest leaders can make huge mistakes, but it's how we respond to our mistakes, by seeking forgiveness and striving to do better, that truly matters. David's story is one of sadness and redemption. It shows that no one is perfect, and that even when we make terrible choices, there is always a chance to turn back to what is good. And through it all, David never lost his love for God, even when his life felt broken. David, the man who conquered giants, led armies, and became the greatest king of Israel, faced a terrifying betrayal from someone very close to him. A betrayal so shocking it turned his world upside down. As David grew older, his health began to fail. He was no longer the mighty warrior he once was. His sons, some of whom were already grown, began to dream of taking the throne for themselves. But one son, Adonijah, became the most dangerous of all. He was handsome, confident, and he believed he should be the next king. Instead of waiting for his father's blessing, Adonijah decided to take the throne by force. In a move that was both sneaky and dangerous, Adonijah held a secret ceremony with the support of some of David's closest advisors. He declared himself king. When David found out, he was filled with shock and fear. How could his own son betray him like this? How could this happen after all David had done for Israel? But David wasn't about to let his kingdom fall apart. Even though he was weak, he made a bold decision. He called for his loyal servant, Bathsheba, and the prophet Nathan. Together, they went to David and reminded him of the promise he had made that Solomon, another of his sons, would be the next king. David, though old and tired, knew this was the moment he had to act. He told Bathsheba to go to Adonijah and make the announcement that Solomon would be king instead. There was a sense of anticipation in the air. Would Adonijah give up his claim? Would the kingdom fall into chaos? As soon as David's command was given, Bathsheba and Nathan quickly went to work, and soon Solomon was anointed as the new king, right in front of all the people of Israel. When Adonijah heard the news, his horror and shame were impossible to hide. He knew that his plot had failed. In a desperate attempt to save himself, Adonijah begged Solomon for mercy, fearing that Solomon would kill him for his rebellion. But Solomon, wise beyond his years, showed compassion and spared his life, at least for the moment. He gave Adonijah a chance to live peacefully, as long as he stayed loyal. David's final days were filled with a mixture of peace and sadness. Though he had been betrayed by his own son, he knew that God had a plan, and Solomon was the one chosen to continue his work. As David lay on his deathbed, he gave his final instructions to Solomon, telling him to remain faithful to God and obey his commands. David's last words were full of love and wisdom, reminding Solomon to be a strong and just king. With those words, David passed away, and the kingdom mourned the loss of their great leader. But through it all, there was a sense of hope. Solomon, though young, would have the chance to build upon his father's legacy and lead Israel into a new chapter. David's life was full of victories and failures, moments of great joy and deep sadness. But in the end, his heart remained faithful to God. Even when his family betrayed him, even when his kingdom was torn by conflict, David never stopped loving God, and he never stopped trusting that God would make things right. David's story teaches us that life is full of ups and downs, and sometimes we have to face betrayal and heartache from the people we love the most. But no matter what happens, we can always turn back to what is good and trust that love and faith will guide us through.